picture this. You have spent months or, maybe even a whole year just saving up for a vacation.
Oh, yeah, the dream trip.
Right. You book the flight, you pack your bags, you secure this perfect hotel, and you finally arrive at a pristine beach in the Caribbean or down in Florida.
You're expecting the postcard.
Exactly. Wait, you are expecting the powdery white sand, a gentle sea breeze, and that crystal clear turquoise water just calling your name.
But then you walk out of the lobby.
Yeah, you walk out and you are greeted by a literal wall of dark brown seaweed. We are talking several feet thick.
It's piled up like a muddy barricade.
A barricade across the entire shoreline. And it smells intensely of rotten eggs.
Oh, that smell is unforgettable.
It really is. So as a tourist, you look at this and immediately see a toxic pollution crisis that's just completely ruining your trip.
Yeah, and a local mayor, looking at that exact same beach, they see something else. They see a massive emergency cleanup bill, something that is about to drain the municipal budget with six-figure costs.
Right. But here's where the story flips in this really weird way.
It's wild. If you rewind just a few weeks and look at that exact same seaweed floating offshore in the open ocean, well, a marine biologist is something completely different.
They see a vital life-saving nursery.
Yeah, a nursery for endangered juvenile sea turtles and this crucial habitat for commercially valuable fish.
It is the ultimate environmental contradiction. We are dealing with an organism that acts as a legally protected ecological hero when it's out at sea.
But it transforms into this devastating coastal villain the very second it washes up onto the sand.
And solving this puzzle, or even just understanding it, requires looking at biology, chemistry, and meteorology all at once.
It's a massive triage problem, one that spans thousands of miles of ocean.
Welcome to Meteorology Matters, the podcast exploring the science, chaos, and stories behind the weather that shapes our world. This show is created by meteorologist Rob Jones.
Today, we are unraveling the paradox of the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt.
Yeah. How did one of the ocean's most valuable ecosystems become one of its greatest coastal challenges? Let's unpack this offshore oasis first.
Sounds good.
Because when we say the word seaweed, I think most people immediately picture the dark green sheets wrapped around their sushi.
Right, or maybe those towering kelp forests.
Yeah, the ones firmly rooted to the ocean floor off the coast of California.
But the organism we are tracking today, sargassum, it plays by an entirely different set of biological rules.
It truly does. So sargassum is a genus of brown macroalgae.
But the specific varieties driving these massive oceanic events, primarily Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans, they are what biologists call holopelagic.
Holopelagic, meaning they never attach to the bottom.
Never. At no point in their life cycle do they attach to the seafloor. They reproduce vegetatively.
Which essentially means they just fragment, right? They break apart and keep growing as clones.
Yeah, they spend their entire continuous existence just floating on the surface of the ocean.
And the way they manage to stay afloat is fascinating to me. They grow these small, spherical, grape-like bladders.
Pneumatocysts.
Yeah.
They act as natural, built-in personal flotation devices.
That's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, these little bladders are filled mostly with oxygen and nitrogen, and they ensure that the plant stays right at the surface.
Because it needs to soak up maximum sunlight for photosynthesis.
All right, so they are essentially permanent sunbathing drifters.
And because they stay right on the surface, they create something that is incredibly rare in the open ocean.
Physical structure.
Yes. If you think about it, the open ocean is functionally a desert. There's water everywhere, but there is nowhere to hide.
It's just a vast, featureless expanse.
But then you introduce these floating, three-dimensional mats and windrows of sargassum.
Suddenly you have an oasis. It provides shade, complex physical structure, and a whole food web for creatures that would otherwise be completely exposed to predators.
The structural complexity is really the foundation of this micro-ecosystem.
It is. When you take a boat out and look closely at a healthy offshore sargassum mat, it is teeming with life.
It's not just a pile of weeds.
Not at all. You have specialized crabs, shrimp, and even seabirds, using it as a resting and feeding platform.
And most importantly, it's a critical nursery for juvenile sea turtles.
Oh, yeah. We are talking about endangered species here.
Like the loggerhead and green sea turtles.
Once those tiny hatchlings make their frantic dash down the beach and actually survive the surf zone, They swim out into the open ocean.
And they are actively seeking these mats.
Yeah, they crawl up into the thick weed to hide from predatory fish and seabirds.
And they find an abundance of food tucked inside the fronds during their most vulnerable developmental years.
Biologists sometimes refer to this as the lost years of a sea turtle's life.
Because they just spend it hidden away in these floating nurseries.
And it's not just turtles. Commercially vital fish species, like mahi-mahi, jacks, amberjacks, and triggerfish.
They all rely heavily on this floating habitat for spawning and hunting.
So calling every offshore patch of this stuff a toxic seaweed blob is, well, it's honestly like calling a thriving old-growth forest hazardous firewood.
Just because trees sometimes blow over and fall on houses.
Yeah, it completely ignores the inherent ecological value of the organism.
The value is so immense that it is actually codified in law. In parts of the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, this floating macroalgae is designated by federal agencies like NOAA.
As essential fish habitat.
Right. And in some specific areas, it's even designated as critical habitat.
That means there are strict, enforceable legal protections against going out to sea and just harvesting it.
You can't just dispatch a fleet of ships to scoop it all up before it hits the beach.
No, because doing so means you would be indiscriminately scooping up baby sea turtles, endangered fish, and a whole localized food chain.
You'd have to navigate this crazy labyrinth of environmental protections designed specifically to save the marine life living inside the mats.
So, if it is this vital, legally protected habitat that acts as a superhero nursery for the ocean.
Why is it suddenly making international headlines as a recurring environmental disaster?
Right. To understand that pivot, we really have to look back at a massive regime shift that happened in our oceans.
Just a little over a decade ago, historically, sailors knew about this seaweed primarily because of the Sargasso Sea.
Which is one of the most unique geographic features on Earth.
It's a vast subtropical gyre located in the North Atlantic.
And what makes it so unusual is that it's the only sea in the world bounded not by coastlines, but entirely by ocean currents.
Yeah, the Gulf Stream forms its western edge.
The North Atlantic Current forms the north.
The Canary Current to the east.
And the North Equatorial Current to the south.
Because of this rotating boundary of water, the Sargasso Sea is relatively calm in the center.
And it naturally traps floating material.
Historically, vast amounts of sargassum. This is the stuff of old maritime legends.
Oh, like Christopher Columbus encountering it in 1492.
Yeah. His crew was terrified they were going to get stuck in it. Or that it meant hidden, shipwrecking rocks were just below the surface.
For centuries, sailors shared these wild myths of ships getting permanently trapped in the thick, unyielding weed.
The myths were exaggerated, obviously, but the biological reality of the Sargasso Sea was relatively stable.
It was a contained ecosystem.
But the modern coastal crisis you see in the news, the one burying beaches in the Caribbean and Florida, is not just the Sargasso Sea overflowing.
No, something fundamentally shifted in the ocean's chemistry and circulation.
Right. And here is where the story takes a massive turn. In 2011, we saw an unprecedented tipping point.
Huge. To give you a sense of the sheer scale we are dealing with now, in 2025, the basin set a satellite-era record for abundance.
And looking at the data for June 2026, the Gulf of Mexico alone saw a record 5 million metric tons of this material.
With the overall basin tracking to be at least the second largest year on record.
5 million metric tons in just one region. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of biomass.
It is. And naturally, when people see numbers like that and see their vacations ruined, they want a simple one-sentence explanation.
Oh, for sure. You frequently read viral headlines blaming fertilizer runoff from the Amazon River.
Or people just point broadly to climate change and say, you know, the oceans are warming, so obviously the seaweed is growing faster.
But the reality is a much more complex recipe.
It's a highly intricate, multivariable recipe. Reducing it to just Amazon runoff or just warming waters ignores the oceanographic reality.
Let's break down the true drivers that birthed the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. First, you need a starter.
Right, research points to a seed event around 2009 and 2010.
During that window, extreme atmospheric and oceanic configurations occurred.
Specifically, highly unusual shifts in the prevailing winds and current anomalies related to the North Atlantic Oscillation.
And these shifts physically pushed a seed population of this algae out of its historical home in the Sargasso Sea.
forcing it far south into the tropical Atlantic.
It's kind of like knocking over a jar of sourdough starter in a warm kitchen.
That's a great way to look at it.
You didn't just move the starter, you spilled it into an environment where it could absolutely thrive.
And this new tropical Atlantic environment turned out to be a massive, perfectly supplied greenhouse.
Like any plant, the algae needs nitrogen and phosphorus to grow.
And in this new home, it found a steady, overlapping supply of nutrients from 3 distinct sources.
First, you have equatorial upwelling,
This is a process where the trade winds push surface water away.
allowing cold, nutrient-dense water from the deep ocean to rise up to the surface layer.
Right into the rootless algae's lap.
And then you have the river discharge.
Yeah, it's not just the Amazon River pumping out nutrients from deforestation and agriculture.
It's also the massive Congo River basin over in Africa discharging into the eastern side of the Atlantic.
The rivers provide this huge pulse of nutrients, but there's a third, often overlooked factor.
Atmospheric deposition. Specifically, Saharan dust.
This one is wild. Huge dust storms sweep across the Sahara Desert in Africa, lifting millions of tons of dust into the atmosphere.
And this dust is incredibly rich in iron and phosphorus.
The trade winds blow it westward across the Atlantic.
And as it settles down onto the ocean surface, it acts like a natural fertilizer.
Because iron is often a limiting nutrient in ocean ecosystems.
Meaning the plants have everything else they need but can't grow until they get iron.
So when that dust settles, it triggers explosive growth.
So you have the seed pushed south, nutrient upwelling from the deep ocean below, river runoff feeding it from the coasts, and Saharan dust raining fertilizer down from the sky.
It's the perfect storm of nutrients.
And to top it all off, you have the water conditions themselves.
Yeah, this algae thrives in typical ocean salinity in warm waters.
Specifically between 18 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 64 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit.
When you align all those factors, the displaced seed population, the multi-source nutrient delivery, and the optimal temperature and salinity.
You get this massive basin-wide proliferation that now dominates the tropical Atlantic.
But I know you wanted to touch on the temperature aspect, especially regarding climate change.
I do. I want to push back on one assumption that gets thrown around a lot. If climate change is warming the oceans overall, and we know this algae likes warm water,
Right.
why isn't the bloom just getting bigger in a straight, predictable line every single year?
Yeah.
Isn't there a point where the water actually gets too warm for it to survive?
This is such a vital point about how climate impacts ocean life. The relationship between ocean warming and these blooms is decidedly not linear.
It's not just a thermostat you turn up.
Exactly. It's true that warmer waters generally speed up biological and metabolic processes, but there is a strict thermal limit. If sea surface temperatures exceed that optimal 30 degrees Celsius threshold, around 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the plant experiences heat stress.
And the growth rate actually crashes.
Yeah, the proteins denature and the plant begins to die off.
And doesn't warmer water also change how the ocean mixes those nutrients we just talked about?
Yes, warmer surface waters increase what we call ocean stratification.
Think of it like oil sitting on top of water.
Right. The warm water becomes lighter and sits firmly on top.
And it refuses to mix with the colder, denser, nutrient-rich water below.
If that stratification is too strong, the upwelling gets blocked.
The nutrients cannot reach the surface layer where the sargassum is floating.
And the algae essentially starves to death, regardless of how perfectly warm the water is.
So a warming ocean alters the timing, the geographic distribution, and the decay rate of the algae.
But it is definitely not a simple equation where turning up the heat automatically equals more seaweed.
Okay, so we have a clear picture of what is fueling this massive 5,000-mile belt across the ocean basin. We have the nutrients, the temperatures, and the seed population.
But having millions of tons of seaweed sitting out in the middle of the Atlantic does not automatically mean your local beach is going to get ruined.
Now, to understand who gets buried in this stuff and who gets to enjoy a pristine beach, we have to look at the meteorology of the conveyor belt.
The transport mechanism dictates everything.
And as meteorologists, we know the atmosphere and the ocean are not separate systems. They work in tandem.
To move these massive biological islands, the grand engine driving all of this is the North Atlantic subtropical high.
This is a persistent, semi-permanent, high-pressure system sitting over the ocean.
Because air flows clockwise around high pressure in the northern hemisphere, it helps establish the easterly trade winds.
These steady trade winds act as the primary atmospheric engine.
Pushing the surface water, and millions of tons of floating algae, generally westward across the Atlantic basin.
Let's trace that macroscopic highway system.
Okay, the material starts moving west, traveling on the North Equatorial Current and the North Brazil Current.
As it pushes toward the Americas, it feeds directly into the Caribbean Current, sweeping rapidly past the Lesser Antilles,
From there, it gets funneled through the Yucatan Channel,
which is that narrow gap between Mexico and Cuba.
and it enters the Gulf of Mexico via the Loop Current.
Some of it gets trapped in swirling eddies in the middle of the Gulf,
But a large portion gets ejected right back out through the Florida Straits.
becoming part of the Florida Current and eventually riding the mighty Gulf Stream all the way up the eastern seaboard.
That is the macro-level view, the interstate highway of ocean currents.
But the physics of landfall, why a massive mat of sargassum hits one specific resort beach and completely spares another one just a mile down the road.
That comes down to microphysics and highly localized weather.
One of the most crucial yet overlooked concepts here is windage.
Right, because of those little gas splatters, the nematocysts.
The sargassum doesn't just sit perfectly submerged in the water.
It sits partially above the water surface, bobbing up into the air.
So it acts like a tiny, porous sail.
This means its trajectory is not dictated purely by the ocean current carrying it.
The surface wind direction is just as critical, often pushing the algae at an angle away from the underlying current.
And that brings us to some fascinating ocean surface physics.
The ocean is not just a uniform sheet of water sliding westward.
No, if you zoom in, there is incredible turbulence and structure. You have Langmuir circulation, for instance.
Langmuir circulation is critical for understanding how this stuff organizes.
When the wind blows steadily across the water, it creates these shallow, parallel, counter-rotating tubes of water right at the surface.
Think of them like invisible horizontal tornadoes spinning next to each other.
Where two of these tubes rotate toward each other and push downward, they create a convergence zone.
All the scattered, fragmented pieces of sargassum get swept into these convergence zones and trapped there.
Organizing into massive, long, parallel lines called windrows that can stretch for miles. Then you have wave-Stokes drift. I love this concept.
Me too, because we usually think of ocean waves as just energy moving through the water, leaving the water molecules in place.
But in reality, as a wave rolls through, the water particles at the surface move in a slight forward circle.
So the actual physical push of the waves rolling forward is constantly nudging the floating material in the direction of wave travel.
Inching it closer and closer to shore.
And we absolutely cannot discuss surface physics without mentioning Ekman transport.
Oh, Ekman transport.
Okay, I have to admit, Ekman transport always sounds completely counterintuitive to me. If the wind is blowing straight west, shouldn't the top layer of the ocean also move straight west?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah. How does the water end up moving at an angle to the wind?
It does seem counterintuitive until you factor in the Earth's rotation, specifically the Coriolis effect.
Ah, the Coriolis effect.
As the wind drags the very top millimeter of water forward, the Earth is spinning underneath it.
In the northern hemisphere, this rotation deflects that moving water slightly to the right of the wind direction.
Then that top layer drags the layer of water beneath it.
But because it's slightly deeper, the friction is lower, and the Coriolis deflection is even stronger.
So it pulls even further to the right.
So it creates this spiraling effect down through the water column.
Yeah, but the net result is that the overall bulk of surface water actually moves roughly 90 degrees to the right of whatever direction the wind is blowing.
That is just wild to me.
So if you have a trade wind blowing steadily from the east toward the west, Ekman transport is actually shoving the bulk surface water
And all the sargassum floating in it.
toward the north. All of these microphysical forces, windage, Langmuir circulation, wave-Stokes drift, and Ekman transport.
They are operating constantly, fighting and collaborating with the broader ocean currents.
But when it comes down to the final mile, whether the seaweed lands on the sand or passes by, it is often determined by very local, short-term weather patterns.
If you're listening to this in Florida, you might have seen this phenomenon firsthand. Consider the impact of a cold front reaching the coast.
Oh, this is a classic scenario.
For weeks, you might have southerly or southeasterly winds steadily piling algae onto the Atlantic beaches. Everyone is bracing for a terrible weekend.
Then, a strong cold front pushes through.
The winds abruptly shift, blowing out of the north or northwest directly offshore.
Within a matter of hours, a beach that was threatened by an approaching mat is magically spared as the wind sweeps the algae back out to sea.
Even smaller than cold fronts are sea breeze circulations.
These are the daily localized winds driven by the temperature difference between the hot land and the cooler ocean,
They can alter nearshore wind directions every single afternoon.
dictating whether a floating patch makes it over that final sandbar or gets held at bay just a few hundred yards offshore.
And we absolutely cannot forget local shoreline geometry. The coastline is not a smooth, flat line.
Right. A southeast-facing beach in Miami or the Florida Keys acts like a giant catcher's mitt when the predominant wind flow is pushing on shore.
But you could have a bay just 10 miles away that happens to be oriented to the southwest, shielded by a small peninsula or a mangrove island.
And it might remain perfectly clear all season long, untouched by the mess happening just around the corner.
When you connect all these layers, from the basin-wide ocean currents down to the afternoon sea breeze and the angle of the local beach,
It becomes incredibly obvious why predicting local impacts is so maddening for coastal managers.
let's run a practical scenario to visualize this. Imagine we tag one single patch of sargassum floating, say, 10 miles off the coast of Puerto Rico.
Okay, tracking one patch.
What exact combination of currents and weather dictates whether it ends up ruining a beach in Cancun, piling up in Miami, or just washing out harmlessly into the open Atlantic?
It is essentially a chaotic gauntlet.
The gauntlet.
Yeah. If our tag patch off Puerto Rico stays in the main, fast-moving axis of the Caribbean current, it moves west at a steady, rapid clip.
If the trade winds are blowing strong and perfectly aligned with the current, it speeds straight toward the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
But suppose it encounters a mesoscale eddy, a large, slow-swirling vortex of water off the coast,
It could get trapped in that eddy for weeks.
just spinning in lazy circles south of Cuba, aging and growing.
And if it eventually breaks free of that eddy,
If it breaks free, passes through the Yucatan Channel, and hits the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico, its fate diverges again.
if the loop current is extended far north into the Gulf, acting like a long lasso,
The patch might ride it all the way up toward the Florida Panhandle or get spun off toward the beaches of Texas.
but if the loop current is retracted and short, the patch takes a sharp right turn, shoots through the Florida Straits.
It's caught by a strong southeasterly wind and gets slammed onto a beach in Miami.
Every single variation in wind speed, wave height, and ocean current alters its final destination.
But when the weather and currents finally do force that patch onto the shore, the biology changes radically and permanently.
That is when the offshore nursery dies and the coastal nightmare begins. Let's talk about the brutal reality of what happens when millions of tons of sargassum make landfall.
The transition from a thriving ecosystem to an environmental hazard is shockingly rapid.
Offshore, it is a living, breathing habitat constantly flushed by clean, cool, oxygenated ocean water.
But onshore, it gets pushed over the sandbar and becomes trapped in warm, stagnant, shallow coastal water.
Or it gets piled directly onto the dry sand.
Deprived of the open ocean circulation and baking under the intense tropical sun, the algae begins to die, desiccate, and rot within 24 to 48 hours.
And as it decomposes, it transforms into a severe public health hazard.
The microbial decomposition of this massive organic load releases hydrogen sulfide gas.
That is the unmistakable, gag-inducing, rotten egg smell. It also releases ammonia.
If you were just a tourist, this is not merely an unpleasant odor that ruins your beach picnic.
Hydrogen sulfide is a genuine, potent respiratory and eye irritant.
In severe concentrations, breathing it in causes dizziness, extreme nausea, and lingering headaches.
It is profoundly hazardous for vulnerable populations.
People living in coastal communities who suffer from asthma, emphysema, or other chronic respiratory diseases can experience severe, life-threatening exacerbations of their symptoms.
They essentially become prisoners in their own homes, unable to open their windows.
Furthermore, it is a major, often underreported occupational hazard for the cleanup crews.
These workers are out there operating heavy machinery in the sweltering heat,
Physically turning over and disturbing the rotting piles.
which suddenly releases trapped pockets of highly concentrated hydrogen sulfide gas directly into their faces.
Beyond the gas, there is a hidden chemical danger that I think most people are completely unaware of.
Oh, this part is alarming. While floating at sea, the sargassum acts like a highly absorbent sponge.
It naturally bioaccumulates heavy metals from the ambient seawater, most notably arsenic.
Wait, naturally occurring arsenic?
Yeah, there are trace amounts in the ocean water, but the plant concentrates it. It is a natural process for marine macroalgae to absorb trace minerals, but the problem lies in the concentration.
When you take millions of tons of this arsenic-loaded biomass and let it rot in one localized spot on a beach.
It begins to break down and leach those heavy metals directly into the local environment, the groundwater, and the nearshore sediment.
You are essentially taking naturally occurring trace toxins and consolidating them into a coastal waste dump.
It's like the coastal ecosystem suddenly has to digest a 10-course meal all at once, and it completely chokes.
We are talking about a full-scale ecosystem collapse in the nearshore environment.
A phenomenon that marine biologists often refer to as the Sargassum brown tide.
The brown tide is an incredibly destructive force.
When you have dense mats of sargassum that are several feet thick piled up in shallow coastal water, they act as an opaque, suffocating blanket.
They completely block all sunlight from reaching the seafloor.
Without sunlight, the essential benthic habitats below, specifically the seagrass meadows like Thalassia testudinum, commonly known as turtlegrass, they cannot photosynthesize.
And those seagrass meadows are the absolute bedrock of the coastal ecosystem.
They physically stabilize the sand with their root systems, preventing massive erosion.
They store enormous amounts of blue carbon.
And they serve as vital nurseries for coastal marine life, like juvenile snappers and crabs.
When the seagrass dies from lack of light, the sediment destabilizes.
The water turns into a muddy soup, and the water quality plummets.
And the devastation goes far beyond just blocking the sun.
The decomposition process itself is incredibly metabolically greedy.
Because all those millions of bacteria working overtime to break down the rotting algae consume massive amounts of dissolved oxygen directly from the water column.
This rapid consumption creates what we call hypoxic or low oxygen conditions.
And eventually anoxic, meaning zero oxygen, dead zones.
It essentially suffocates everything trapped in the shallow water.
Fish, crabs, starfish, and benthic organisms living on the seafloor simply cannot extract enough oxygen to survive.
Corals are particularly vulnerable here. They're already severely stressed by global warming and bleaching events.
And when they are suddenly plunged into darkness and starved of oxygen by a rotting blanket of seaweed, they experience rapid mass mortality.
We saw this horrific reality unfold in 2018 in Quintana Roo, Mexico,
where the brown tide resulted in a massive, catastrophic, multi-species die-off of the entire nearshore reef community.
And then there's the sea turtle paradox, which is just absolutely heartbreaking.
Remember earlier how we highlighted that the offshore mats are vital, life-saving nurseries for baby sea turtles?
Well, the very same turtles that rely on it for survival at sea face a literal wall of death when they interact with it on the beach.
The irony is profound and devastating. Adult female sea turtles, returning to their natal beaches to lay the next generation of eggs, encounter these massive barricades of rotting biomass blocking the shoreline.
They either cannot physically climb over the mountains of seaweed to reach the dry, safe sand,
or they expend so much precious energy trying to push through it that they become exhausted and abandon the nesting attempt entirely,
dropping their eggs in the water where they will drown.
And even if a female does manage to navigate the maze and lay a successful nest, the hatchlings that emerge weeks later face a terrifying obstacle course.
They emerge from the sand and immediately get tangled in the dense, toxic wrack, trying to reach the water.
They become easy pickings for birds and crabs.
Moreover, there's a thermal threat to the nests themselves.
The massive rotting piles of algae on the beach generate their own intense heat through the microbial decomposition process, much like a heavily active compost pile.
This localized heat can actually raise the temperature of the sand below.
This is critical because sea turtle sex determination is entirely temperature dependent.
Warmer sand produces females, and cooler sand produces males.
The artificial heat from the rotting algae can fatally alter nest incubation,
severely skewing the sex ratio of the hatchlings toward all females, or in extreme cases, literally cooking the eggs before they ever hatch.
So if you are keeping track, we have a collapsed nearshore ecosystem, suffocating marine life, toxic heavy metals leaching into the sand, and beaches that smell like sulfur and rotting eggs.
Naturally, this triggers an absolute five-alarm crisis for local economies and municipal budgets.
The economic toll is staggering, especially when you factor in that tourism is the undisputed lifeblood of the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and South Florida.
The visual impact alone is economically devastating.
We live in the age of social media where a vacation's success is heavily tied to aesthetics.
Viral photos of murky brown water and TripAdvisor reviews complaining bitterly about the unbreathable stench of rotten eggs spread instantly across the internet.
This leads to massive cascading waves of canceled hotel bookings, drastically reduced occupancy rates, and staggering lost revenue for everyone in the community.
From the resort owners down to the local restaurant workers, taxi drivers, and excursion guides.
But the impacts stretch far beyond just the tourism sector.
Exactly. Local commercial fishermen and charter fishing guides completely lose access to their traditional fishing grounds.
They cannot navigate through the thick mats because the seaweed gets sucked into their boat engine intakes.
Destroying the impellers and causing the engines to overheat and fail.
Or the fish they are trying to catch simply flee the hypoxic dead zones, leaving the area entirely.
And it also threatens critical, life-sustaining infrastructure. Look at what happened in the U.S. Virgin Islands in the summer of 2022.
The 2022 event in the USVI is a perfect example of a biological event becoming an infrastructural catastrophe.
The sheer unprecedented volume of seaweed washing into the bays completely clogged the intake pipes for the island's major desalination plant.
Desalination works by pulling massive amounts of seawater in and forcing it through reverse osmosis membranes to create fresh drinking water.
When those intake pipes get choked with millions of pounds of algae, the plant has to shut down.
When an island's primary source of fresh, potable drinking water is threatened by seaweed, you have moved way past a tourism inconvenience and straight into a critical federal emergency.
And that municipal emergency comes with an astronomical price tag.
Let's look at the hard costs of removal. Miami-Dade County recently proposed a 5-year contract worth up to roughly $16 million just for seasonal seaweed management.
During the peak of the inundation crisis in the U.S. Virgin Islands, they were facing direct removal costs of $25,000 per day.
Small, independent island nations and local municipalities are essentially being handed a completely unpayable invoice by the ocean.
And the choices for how to actually execute the cleanup are agonizing for local managers.
None of them are perfect. Every option involves a painful compromise.
Let's walk through the tactical options on the table. First, you have aggressive mechanical removal.
You bring in the heavy equipment industrial front-end loaders, massive beach tractors, and specialized conveyor belt machines.
The obvious benefit is speed. It clears the beach quickly and gets the tourists back on the sand.
But the collateral damage to the beach ecosystem is immense.
Mechanical removal is essentially a blunt instrument.
When a front-end loader scoops up a ton of wet algae, it also scoops up massive amounts of clean sand trapped underneath it.
Over a single season, you are literally trucking the beach away, leading to severe, accelerated beach erosion.
This just creates a secondary economic crisis, where the municipality has to spend millions more on dredging and beach nourishment projects to replace the lost sand.
Furthermore, the sheer weight of these heavy machines rolling back and forth over the shoreline severely compacts the sand.
This compaction crushes any undetected turtle nests
and completely destroys the natural habitat of ghost crabs, shorebirds, and the fauna living in the sand.
You are essentially strip mining the delicate beach ecosystem just to keep the surface looking pristine for a photograph.
So if heavy machinery is too destructive and removes too much sand, what about manual removal?
Just send out large crews of workers with pitchforks, rakes, and wheelbarrows to carefully clear it by hand.
Manual removal is, without question, infinitely safer for the environment.
It allows workers to selectively and carefully remove the offensive algae while leaving the sand and the natural, healthy rackline of normal seaweed intact.
It drastically minimizes harm to hidden turtle nests.
However, the flaw is scale. It is impossibly slow.
When you are dealing with millions of tons of heavy biomass washing ashore relentlessly, wave after wave, day after day,
human labor simply cannot keep pace with the sheer volume.
It is a logistical impossibility to manually clear a major inundation event before it begins to rot.
So then people logically say, well, don't let it hit the beach in the first place. Stop it in the water. Use offshore booms.
Similar to the containment booms they use to corral oil spills.
Attempting to block it offshore seems incredibly logical on paper, but it is fraught with immense engineering challenges in the real world.
The ocean, particularly the nearshore surf zone, is an incredibly dynamic and energetic environment.
The constant wave action, tidal shifts, and strong coastal currents generate massive physical forces.
Forces that frequently overtop, sink, or completely destroy physical containment booms.
And even when the booms do manage to hold the line, the seaweed doesn't just disappear, it piles up against the barrier.
You still have to send out specialized, expensive skimming vessels to constantly empty the containment area, which adds massive operational costs.
Furthermore, stretching miles of booms across coastal waters obstructs navigable waterways for local boat traffic.
And crucially, they can inadvertently entangle marine life.
We end up trapping and drowning the very sea turtles and dolphins we are desperately trying to protect.
Which brings us to the most frustrating yet consistently viral part of the conversation: beneficial use.
Oh, I see these headlines all the time.
Every few months, there's a new viral story.
Startup turns toxic seaweed into eco-friendly fertilizer, or teenagers invent building bricks made of ocean algae.
Company plans to turn sargassum into biofuel.
It sounds like the absolute perfect utopian solution. Take a nuisance and turn it into a valuable commodity.
Right.
If it's such a valuable resource, why isn't this completely solving the problem? Are we just vastly underestimating how hard it is to process this stuff?
We are vastly underestimating the chemistry and logistics.
The gap between a successful laboratory proof of concept, where a scientist processes a small, clean bucket of seaweed, and an industrial-scale beneficial use facility processing millions of tons, is an absolute chasm.
The media hype rarely matches the industrial reality because of the fundamental nature of the harvested material.
When you scoop this algae off the beach or out of the surf zone, you are not getting clean, pure plant matter.
You are dealing with wet tons.
Let's break down what a wet ton actually entails.
The biomass is heavily saturated with salt water.
It is dense and heavy with trapped sand.
It is thoroughly tangled with marine microplastics and garbage from the ocean.
And, as we discussed earlier, it is chemically contaminated with naturally bioaccumulated high levels of arsenic and other heavy metals.
Processing that exact cocktail of materials safely, consistently, and at a massive industrial scale is incredibly difficult and wildly expensive.
If you want to turn it into agricultural fertilizer, for instance, you cannot simply take salt and arsenic-laden mush and spread it on commercial farm fields.
The salt will destroy the soil's airability, and the arsenic will contaminate the crops and enter the human food chain.
You have to wash it thoroughly.
And washing millions of tons of salty seaweed requires millions of gallons of fresh water.
Fresh water is a highly scarce and incredibly expensive resource on many Caribbean islands.
You are trading a seaweed problem for a water crisis.
You have to expend massive amounts of fresh water to wash the salt out.
Then you have to utilize complex, expensive chemical processing to extract the heavy metals.
You have to mechanically separate the sand and the plastics.
And you have to do all of this while managing a highly variable, unpredictable seasonal supply chain.
A processing plant might be completely overwhelmed with raw material in June, requiring massive storage facilities for rotting biomass.
And then find itself completely starved of raw material in December when the winds shift.
The sheer economics of building, staffing, and running a specialized facility under those erratic constraints are incredibly daunting for any business.
Because we cannot easily block it with booms, and we cannot easily sell it and process it into fertilizer, the absolute best defense a coastal community has is simply knowing exactly when, where, and how much is going to hit.
That requires highly accurate, advanced forecasting.
Monitoring this 5,000-mile belt relies heavily on cutting-edge, space-based technology.
Institutions like the University of South Florida's Optical Oceanography Lab and federal agencies like NOAA utilize satellites.
Satellites equipped with highly specialized optical sensors, such as MODIS and virayers.
These aren't just taking regular photographs from space. They are designed to measure what is called the floating algae index.
Let's delve into how that actually works, because it's brilliant. Plant matter, including sargassum, contains chlorophyll for photosynthesis.
Chlorophyll absorbs visible light, particularly blue and red wavelength, but it strongly reflects near-infrared light.
Water, on the other hand, strongly absorbs near-infrared light.
So by analyzing the specific wavelengths of light reflecting off the ocean surface, scientists can essentially filter out the ocean water and detect the distinct spectral signature.
The bright near-infrared glow of floating vegetation.
This allows them to estimate the density and distribution of the algae across the entire Atlantic basin.
And all of this complex satellite data feeds into practical forecasting tools.
Like the recently upgraded NOAA and USF Daily Sargassum Inundation Risk Tool, known as SAR version 1.5.
This tool takes the raw satellite imagery of where the algae is, combines it with complex oceanographic models of currents and wind vectors, and provides regional risk assessments.
It essentially highlights coastal areas on a map in red, orange, or yellow based on the calculated probability of their shores being inundated in the coming days.
These tools are undeniable marvels of modern oceanography, but it is vital for local governments and the public to understand their limitations.
This brings us to what meteorologists and emergency managers call the last-mile forecasting problem.
It is very much like a weather radar showing a massive, severe thunderstorm system moving generally over the state.
That broad radar image tells emergency managers they need to prepare resources, but it does not tell a specific homeowner if their individual basement is going to flood at exactly 2:00 p.m.
The parallel is spot on. Satellites can clearly and accurately show a million-ton mat of biomass floating 50 miles offshore in the Caribbean current.
But they cannot guarantee what the beachfront of a specific resort in Punta Cana will look like at sunrise tomorrow.
Satellites, despite their sophistication, are hindered by several physical limitations. First and foremost is cloud cover.
The tropical Atlantic is notoriously cloudy, and clouds completely blind the optical sensors. If it's cloudy for a week, you lose track of the mats.
Second, you have sun glint, the harsh reflection of the sun bouncing off the ocean waves, which can overwhelm and obscure the sensor data.
And finally, sensor resolution plays a massive role.
A satellite sensor might take an average reading over a 1-kilometer pixel of ocean and calculate a broad abundance estimate.
But it cannot resolve the small-scale 10-foot-wide windrows formed by Langmuir circulation.
Nor can it predict exactly how the highly localized afternoon sea breeze and nearshore wave refraction will arrange that biomass on a specific stretch of sand.
So, if the technology can give us the big picture basin-wide but cannot provide a hyper-local, down-to-the-minute beach schedule, what does competent modern seasonal preparedness actually look like for a coastal community?
Competent management means utterly abandoning the reactive approach.
Communities should not be waiting until they smell hydrogen sulfide in the morning air to start frantically looking for solutions and calling contractors.
It requires what we call threshold-based management.
This means having pre-season, legally binding contracts already signed with cleanup crews, environmental monitors, and heavy equipment operators months before the season starts.
It means having designated, environmentally compliant disposal sites situated away from groundwater sources already permitted and ready to receive thousands of tons of material on day one.
It means establishing a daily workflow that integrates the broad satellite risk data with very local daily wind and wave forecasts to deploy resources efficiently.
Targeting the most vulnerable beaches before the rotting process begins.
And in discussing preparedness, we have to acknowledge the massive, unavoidable disparity in resources here.
When you look at heavily funded municipal operations in South Florida or the massive, internationally funded resort-backed beaches in Quintana Roo, Mexico,
they possess fleets of custom-designed beach tractors, specialized conveyor boats, and multi-million-dollar municipal budgets dedicated solely to this issue.
But compare that sheer financial firepower to smaller, developing island nations in the Lesser Antilles or public beaches in rural coastal areas.
They are facing the exact same basin-scale oceanographic phenomenon, the exact same wall of toxic seaweed.
But they fundamentally lack the municipal budget, the heavy machinery, and the land space to fight a daily war against the ocean.
The inequality in how this environmental crisis is experienced, endured, and managed across the region is stark and deeply concerning.
It forces us to confront a very difficult long-term reality. We are no longer dealing with an anomaly. We are learning to live with a radically transformed ocean.
The sheer scale, resilience, and seasonal recurrence of the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt mean that ad hoc, panic-driven emergency responses are no longer mathematically or economically sufficient.
Which brings us to the future and what all of this ultimately means for our evolving relationship with the ocean.
There is a paradigm-shifting idea currently emerging in the scientific community that fundamentally changes how we view this belt.
What if the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt is no longer dependent on the extreme weather events of 2009 and 2010 that originally seeded it, or even the annual pulse of river nutrients?
The latest data increasingly points toward a phenomenon known as ecological control.
This implies that the total volume of biomass within the belt is now so immense, so geographically vast, that it is actually internally recycling its own nutrients.
As the older layers of algae die and sink, or as the incredibly diverse multi-species ecosystem living within it produces biological waste, it creates a massive self-sustaining nutrient loop right there in the open ocean.
So you're saying it may no longer need an anomalous Amazon river flood or a bizarre shift in the North Atlantic Oscillation to trigger a massive bloom.
It has reached a critical mass where it sustains itself.
Exactly that. It has firmly established itself not as a passing phase, but as a permanent self-sustaining feature of the Atlantic Ocean's geography, a new continent of floating life.
That concept forces a total radical evolution in our environmental thinking. We are standing on the shoreline, forced to hold two seemingly contradictory truths in our minds at the exact same time.
We have to figure out how to conserve and aggressively protect this organism as a miraculous, endangered nursery while it is thriving at sea.
And simultaneously marshal the resources to fight it as a hazardous, toxic emergency the moment it hits the land.
The ocean is not giving us easy black and white answers anymore. It is demanding that we adapt to the incredibly complex, nuanced reality it is presenting to us.
That is the core of it. If you want to keep exploring the chaos, the science, and the intricate stories of our changing world, you can follow Rob Jones on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. Make sure to like, follow, comment, and rate the show. It truly helps us keep bringing you these explorations of the forces shaping our planet.
It's been great exploring all this today.
You've been listening to Meteorology Matters, created by meteorologist Rob Jones. Thanks for listening, and remember, meteorology always matters.